Well, let's go ahead and get started, and people can continue to come in as they come in. So I want to welcome first our panelists for joining us today for our June Tea Talk. It's great to have you. And we want to thank everyone who registered and for joining our program. Today's Tea Talk, as we're sipping on some Bengal Spice, that's my tea of choice for today, is to have a conversation around reproductive rights for individuals with disabilities. What does that look like? We've been joined today, by the Ketchikan Bay Family Planning Clinic. So with us are Dr. Robin Holmes. She's the medical director of the Family Planning Clinic. We also have Carolyn Norton, who guides the Rec Teen Sexual Health Peer Education and After School programs for the clinic. Excuse me, a tickle in my throat. And Claudia Haynes, who is the CEO of the Planning Clinic. So I am actually just going to go right on in and turn this right over to the Planning Clinic and have them jump right in.
Do you want to introduce the clinic a little bit, Claudia, and then we can?
Yes, I would love to. And just a quick technical question. Crystal, do you want me to, or one of us to share slides, or do you want to manage that?
What would be easier? We can do either or. I can shoot them over to Vern real quick, or if you can send the actual slides over to Vern, or we can just have you guys go ahead and do it as you're speaking.
How about this? How about I will bring them up as I am introducing the clinic. How about that?
Okay, that works.
My two sides of my brain will be working here. So hello, everybody. We're so glad you're here. As Crystal mentioned, I'm the CEO at Ketchikan Bay Family Planning Clinic here in Homer. And our organization has supported primarily the Southern Kenai Peninsula as both a clinic and an education program now for almost 40 years. We started out as a volunteer operation and then have kind of evolved over time to meet the needs of both adults and teens with the reproductive health care and the education program that Dr. Holmes and Carolyn are going to talk about. And so we're really glad to be here as part of this discussion and are always looking at ways to kind of better serve our community, and that idea of community really includes whoever connects with us as an organization. So I am going to open the slides and turn it over to Dr. Holmes here. So bear with me.
I will start introducing myself while you're doing that. I'm Robin Holmes. Hi, she, her. I'm a family physician. I work here at Ketchikan Bay Family Planning Clinic, where I am the medical director and provide care to patients part-time. My full-time day job is actually with Ninilchik Community Clinic, part of the Ninilchik Village Tribe, which is on the Southern Kenai Peninsula. So I'm happy to speak on behalf of them and my experience with that job as well. Prior to moving down to the peninsula in August of last year, almost a year, I was working in Fairbanks. I worked at two clinics there, a private practice and a federally qualified health center. And before that, I did my residency in Anchorage. So I've got some experience in a couple different places in the state, more recently here. But today we're speaking about reproductive health care for those living with disabilities. And we've got some slides. Carolyn, do you want to introduce yourself now and then we can move into the slides? Does that sound reasonable?
Sure, that sounds great. Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn Norton. My pronouns are she and they, and I am the youth program manager at Ketchikan Bay Family Planning Clinic, which means I run the rec room, which is a teen drop-in center, and I also run the peer education team, which provides education to folks in schools and out of schools around the area on sexual and reproductive health care and a number of other things. So I'll talk more about that when we get to me, but that is me.
thanks. Okay, it looks like we're almost ready. If Claudia can get it to show in presentation mode, perfect. So the idea behind this presentation, from what I understand, talking to the Access Alaska folks, is that this is an open conversation. This is the first time we've really focused on reproductive health care in the setting of people living with disabilities. So we're going to be touching on a lot of topics that we are not experts on. I think we're here to bring the reproductive health care perspective. We are the only freestanding reproductive health center on the Kenai Peninsula. But I am expecting to be getting a lot of feedback about experiences for those living with disabilities or caregivers for those living with disabilities. So I think I can also speak for Carolyn that we don't see ourselves as experts at all. So please, please, please jump in if we're saying anything that doesn't seem to drive with you guys' experiences. Hopefully we can get some audience participation. So cool. I'm going to get started. A couple of goals for this talk. Thank you, Claudia, for advancing the slides. These are top three: are understanding the challenges around reproductive health for those with disabilities. This is an exchange of information and resources to improve the environment around healthcare and reproductive healthcare in particular. Carolyn's going to talk about sharing the importance of sexual health education for adolescents. And then again, like I just said, having a conversation. Next slide, please. Maybe next slide. Cool. So I thought I would start with what is reproductive health, and some top experiences that you guys may have questions about is what is the experience like at a reproductive health clinic versus a traditional clinic, why you would choose this over another medical home, and what are some misconceptions about reproductive health. So again, I'm speaking as someone who works at a freestanding reproductive health clinic. So other examples besides our clinic would be Planned Parenthood, right? That's the other one in the state. And off the top of my head, I can't think of another freestanding reproductive health clinic. You may see some in the lower 48, but in the state of Alaska, it's us and Planned Parenthood. What the experience is like there is you're seeing experts on reproductive health, and what reproductive health means is anything having to do with bodily autonomy, having to do with reproduction. So trying to get pregnant, trying to not get pregnant, testing for sexually transmitted diseases, getting educated about your options around any of those things. So I think that people think of reproductive health clinics as places where you go to get treated for your chlamydia and maybe to get your birth control, which are huge aspects of that. But for us in particular, and I think I can speak for Planned Parenthood as well, it's just nice to have that place where you are getting a really comprehensive experience. And especially because all you deal with at a reproductive health clinic is things that have to do with reproductive health care, I think you can spend a lot more time with people, getting to know what their bodily autonomy preferences are. And so that's the main difference, right? We have time to focus on that without having to worry about treating your diabetes, right? So it's sort of like seeing a specialist. Why you would choose it over another medical home? There's a lot of reasons. I think in my experience, and even my friends who are doctors and non-doctors, I think you just get a little bit more attention to detail when it comes to reproductive health. So for example, there's pills that help to prevent the transmission of HIV. And I can't tell you for sure that if you were to go and see another family physician, that they would know that those recommendations were updated to really broaden the recommendations to a lot more folks who wouldn't have qualified for that medication, right? Because they're not experts in the health field. So that's one reason. Another reason is just there's a little bit of a different feeling, a little bit more emphasis on the individual, and there's a lot more resources. So most reproductive health clinics have rapid testing available for some common STIs, sexually transmitted infections. Most reproductive health clinics are going to have all the birth control options on the shelf for those who don't have insurance. So it's a little bit more of a focused experience. There's some misconception about reproductive health in that I think one of the misconceptions is you think Planned Parenthood, all they do is abortions, and that's not true. Our clinic, just off for the record, doesn't do abortions, but I think that's one big misconception. Another misconception is that you don't need to go to a reproductive health clinic if you're just trying to avoid pregnancy, and that's not true either. We do a lot of education around timing, around taking birth control for other reasons, around preparing your body if you are trying to get pregnant. So these are important things that a lot of primary care providers just don't have time to get to in a busy schedule. So yeah, I think that's it for this slide. So let's move to the next one. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat. If someone can keep an eye on the chat box for me, if there seems to be something that seems really timely to one of these slides, I'm happy to be interrupted as we go. Just put that out there. So reproductive health in the setting of disability, again, these are some points that I've seen in my practice. And I just wanted to touch on them. I'm sure other people have seen other things in their experience as well. And there's a slide later on where we can have a conversation about that. But the big one, and I put this first, is because there is a lack of provider training about this. I read a paper that said that only 17% of OB-GYN, so that's obstetrics and gynecology residents, graduated with any formalized training in specific issues for those with disabilities. So we're not trained. In that same study, only less than half of them said that they felt actually moderately comfortable providing comprehensive health care to those with disabilities. So that's, down to how mobility issues might affect the ability to do a pap smear, right? So a lot of these things are new to some providers as well. I think the history and ongoing coercion and forced sterilization of people with disabilities is a huge barrier to overcome, both from a provider perspective and from a client perspective. And that's real and it's ongoing. And I can talk some more about that. There is a Supreme Court ruling that legalizes sterilization without the consent of the patient. And that's still standing. That hasn't been overturned since it was passed in the early 1900s. It's a state by state basis. So that's still ongoing. Tied into that, I think privacy is a huge issue. Some people with disabilities have a disability with communication, and every time they go to a doctor's office, they go in with another person who may be their mandated guardian, anything of that nature. And reproductive health and privacy are very intimately intertwined, right? It's not like you're going to the doctor to try and get a new piece of equipment like a wheelchair where you don't necessarily mind that your caregiver is there. Sometimes privacy is a different ball game when we're talking about reproductive health. Consent, same issue, right? Where is the line between consent and privacy and reproductive health? Implicit bias on the part of the provider and on the part of the caregiver, and even on the part of the client, right? Having an implicit bias that the provider is going to try and talk you into getting something like a forced sterilization procedure, which is maybe a good implicit bias. Maybe some of these things are healthy, but a lot of times they're not, and recognizing that. I think there's a huge component of interpersonal violence in those with disabilities that plays into any conversation having to do with reproductive health care. And then the transition from being a youth to an adult. So I think most of us can come up with an example of a disability that gets diagnosed in childhood, whether it's physical or mental. And how do we transition from a child, an adolescent, and into adulthood when it comes to these people with disabilities? and their reproductive health choices and bodily autonomy. So all of these are things to think about. This is just a overview of contraceptive options. I like this slide because it shows you the intricacies of all these different options. This particular one is organized in order from how good they are at getting you pregnant to how not good they are at getting you pregnant. I think for someone with disabilities, especially, pregnancy is one of the many, many options that go into your choice of birth control methods. And these tables may not be designed specifically for your cultural preferences, but there's a lot of complexity and a lot of options out there, which then goes into my next slide. So we can go ahead. Because what people living with disabilities choose as far as birth control specifically is a little bit different than what people who aren't living with disabilities choose. And this is based on a couple of research papers, but when we talk about the different options, we talk about, you know, options that have a lot more user input. So pills, patches, rings. Then there's sort of a moderate effective middle ground, which is the depot shot or similar. And then there's these longer acting options like having an intrauterine device. Brand names might be Paragard, Liletta, Mirena, maybe you've heard of some of them, or the arm implant. So, and then sterilization, which we've already touched on. So people, and this could be the individual's choice, and this could be what they got talked into, quote unquote, or it could be what their caregiver preferred, right? And kind of sussing out all those details is difficult to do. The statistics that I'm quoting here, the people with disabilities were self-reported disabilities. So it could have just, it's not necessarily run by diagnosis codes or anything like that, but people with physical disabilities, we see more female sterilization. They tend to choose birth control pills less frequently. They are less likely to be offered the more effective methods like IUDs, the implant, and the shot, which is very interesting. It's a little bit different than what we see in people with cognitive disabilities. Still see more increased female sterilization. So male-bodied people, we don't see that trend as much. People with cognitive disabilities are more likely to not use any contraception versus people who don't experience a cognitive disability. Again, fewer IUDs and implants, but what's interesting, I think, for someone with a cognitive versus a physical disability is that we do see slightly more use of the depot shot. That's interesting. I don't know why. Maybe it's a personal preference. Maybe you have other things about that birth control method that you like. One of the things looking at this is it's not just about avoiding pregnancy, but I didn't put this in my slide before, but one of the big reasons people with disabilities choose to use birth control is to suppress their menstrual cycles because it's a pain in the butt, especially if you have a physical disability to have to deal with that. And that is also kind of interesting because a lot of more effective birth control methods that keep you from getting pregnant also suppress your period. So it's just kind of interesting that we see these statistics with people with physical disabilities. So again, another point for conversation that I think is super important to think about. Next slide. Yes, here's something. All people with disabilities, male, female, in between, are experiencing higher rates of unintended pregnancy than those without disabilities. So this is a conversation that needs to be had and needs to not be ignored. And I think it gets ignored a lot because of some of those reasons I talked about with the challenges. So next slide. I did want to put in a slide for people who are born male or male-bodied folks, because I think there's, when we think about reproductive health care, sometimes we don't think about male-bodied people as much. No offense to the female-bodied people. So I think there's a lot of mental and physical reproductive challenges. Chronic medical conditions affect men's sexuality in ways that they don't affect female-bodied people. And that can be diabetes, that can be hypertension, that could be strokes, that can be car accidents. It affects everyone, but men, because of the way reproductive health works for them, can experience different issues than women. There's a lack of recognition of violence against female-bodied people, but there's certainly a lack of recognition of the violence against male-bodied people, and especially those with disabilities from a young age. There's this responsibility, I think, in our culture that gets placed on male-bodied people of obtaining consent, which can be difficult for people with, I would say, quote unquote, invisible disabilities, cognitive disabilities. And the same is true of female-bodied people, where it can be hard to obtain consent around sexual and reproductive health. But I think there's an assumption in our culture that men are responsible for obtaining consent, and that is really difficult in those with invisible disabilities. This last point, again, reproductive health is tied to a lot of medications and chronic conditions. So, and I'll share more resources at the end, but I have found that Christopher Reeve Institute, if you ever forget Superman, right, was physically disabled. Tons and tons and tons of great resources about reproductive health care and issues facing male-bodied people. So,
Robin, we have a question in the chat.
yeah.
It says, with sterilization, is there any progress within Alaska to remove sterilization without that person's consent?
You know, that is a great question. I'll have to dig into it a little bit more for the state of Alaska specifically, because it is a state-by-state basis at this point. The problem with consent is that if you have someone who has a disability where they're unable to give consent, then that consent falls on whoever has been designated as their medical consent giver, right? So let's say they're nonverbal from having a stroke or any other reason why they would be nonverbal. And so it's hard to write a law that's just, you can't do this without the patient's consent. And I need to look at that. And so I'll probably look for that while Carolyn's talking. But yes, I should know state of Alaska, unless someone else on this call knows, which would be great. Next. Okay, so this is a brainstorm of tips for, sorry, that's supposed to say from providers to the clients and caregivers about sexual and reproductive health. One is to talk with your loved ones beforehand so that you're not in the doctor's office having the conversation for the first time. Although if you like the protection of the doctor's office to be a mediator, that's totally fine too. Insurance is a big question. So for example, does Medicare cover certain birth control options that you had in mind? Or if you have a private healthcare plan, sometimes they're all mandated to provide contraception, but do they cover different options at a higher or less coverage rate? Anticipating that your provider may not have all the answers, like I just demonstrated. Considering a reproductive health clinic, because if you're a person who experiences disabilities, your reproductive health care is something that is very nuanced in ways that not all providers maybe have experience with. I'm not saying you have to go to a reproductive healthcare clinic, but if you've had, especially if you've had some traumatic experiences with doctors in the past, I think that a reproductive health clinic may be a good choice for you. And then trusting your instincts. If you're getting information from a provider that doesn't feel right to you, it may be that they are giving you inaccurate information. So getting a second opinion is your right, and you should think about it if your instincts are, if your heckles are raised.
Another question from the chat regarding consent. If a person has a guardian and the guardian is against that person having sex and taking birth control, are there any rights for that person?
Yeah, this is where reproductive health in people with disabilities is so nuanced, right? Because if you are someone who has been told that you can't make your own medical decisions, reproductive health is not a medical decision. But if you're someone who has no autonomy, it makes it very difficult. So legally, you should still have your reproductive rights protected. in the state of Alaska. So let's say, I think there's there's legally what are you entitled to, and then realistically. So let's say that you want to date someone, but you can't drive. This becomes a big issue because you rely on your guardian to be able to leave the house. And so this is where we get into that coercion and the sort of history of coercion, because you can't just call the police and say, hey, this person's not letting me date because they won't let me leave the house. That's really difficult to do. It's a really difficult thing to prove, especially for someone with disabilities. So legally, if you're able to give consent, you're able to do this. Even if you have a guardian who's appointed to, let's say, manage your finances, that can easily turn into, well, you don't have your own money to go on a date, right? So legally, you have your own rights to be able to be sexually active, but at the same time, there's all of these real world challenges. And I'm not sure if anyone's found ways around that. I'd be really happy to hear anyone's experiences with that.
And then we have another question that says, do you see a higher number of unintended pregnancies from caregivers to the person with the disability?
Say that one more time.
Do you see a higher number of unintended pregnancies from caregivers to the person with the disability? I'm not sure I 100% understand that question. So if that person wants to submit a little bit of clarification, that might be helpful. But Robin, do you think you understand?
I don't want to assume that I'm interpreting. What I would interpret that to mean is, are we seeing that caregivers are causing unintended pregnancies in the disabled person? Yes.
Yeah, a clarification,
Yeah.
caregivers taking advantage of their consumers. Yes.
I don't know that I could speak to that level of detail based on any literature, but what I would say is that statistically across the board, not talking necessarily about what I've seen written down, is that it's not necessarily always the caregiver, but someone else that the client or the patient or the disabled person is in contact with on a regular basis. So an example would be the caregiver is a spouse, and the violence would come from maybe a cousin or a next door neighbor or someone like that. So someone, it's still with someone you know. I can't give you statistics though, so I don't want to sound like I'm an expert on that.
Another question, it says, I know you mentioned that Kachemak Bay Family Planning does not provide abortion services. Having access to timely and safe abortion is critical for disabled people who are seeking those services. Are there any plans to provide or facilitate self-managed abortion for folks who are in need of that medical care?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Without going down that rabbit hole too much, the laws are very much in flux around provision of care to those with unwanted pregnancies. That is going to go back to this question, the big question in the room, which is, what if you have been deemed not able to make your own medical decisions, and perhaps you would have wanted to have an abortion and your caregiver doesn't believe in abortion? I think that that's a really difficult situation. And what ends up happening in those situations is that if you can't advocate for yourself and you never even make it to a physician's office, it's really hard for you to access those services. But if you make it to a physician's office, there's situations where two physicians can get together, and if it's pretty clear, this is what happens with like end of life care as well, for example. If it's pretty clear that the wishes of the patient and the wishes of the medical decision maker are at odds with each other based on previous statements that the patient may have said, two physicians can get together and override what the caregiver is saying. But that is so difficult to do until you make it to actually see a doctor, right? In the case of abortion care, you might not even make it to see the doctor because your caregiver didn't take you to the doctor who provides abortions, right? So that's a very difficult thing. As far as your self-administered medication question, there's online services that we've probably all seen or heard of popping up My understanding of how that's working right now, because mail order mifepristone, which is the medication for abortions, is not fully legal yet. They're working on it. Is that those services are in some sort of legal gray zone and often ordering the pills internationally. I have also heard from other providers in the reproductive healthcare community that the instructions that people are getting seem to be pretty sound. There's some other issues with that self-administered medication thing, like you don't know how far along you are and you end up taking pills and were several months more pregnant than you thought you were. So again, gray area, sort of like when marijuana started becoming legal, and there's a lot of legal gray area. We'll see. I don't have a great answer for that. As of right now, I can tell you that there's not any providers in the state of Alaska that are mailing abortion pills. You still have to go into a clinic to take the abortion pills at all the clinics who are providing them in the state of Alaska. I can't really speak to the online services though.
And then there was a follow-up in the chat to one of the previous questions. Karen says, a person who's being told they can't have sex or date who they want to by their guardian can call the Disability Law Center of Alaska at 1-800-478-1234 or email us at akpa@dlcak.org. I don't know what the remedy would be, but it's a conversation it seems like we could have with them. Totally agree that it may be more nuanced than can be fixed by a lawyer. Thank you for that, Karen.
Yes, and to snowball off of that, physicians can help with that if you can get the person into a physician or a psychiatrist. Sometimes having a written statement from a physician or a psychiatrist can be very helpful in those situations. So to follow up on a previous question, I was able to pull this up. Looks like this is from 2022. In Alaska, it is forced sterilization is banned. If someone is under guardianship, they cannot be forced to be sterilized unless there is a danger to their physical health. Some people under guardianship who want to be sterilized might not be able to get sterilization. I can post the link to this in the chat. These are really great questions, you guys. I'm so excited to be having this conversation. So these are some common misconceptions that I've found from people and from a couple of websites to make sure that I got a clear picture. But I think the first one is that people with disabilities are asexual, which I think we can all agree, like sex is super awesome and people love it. So that's a horrible assumption to be making. That people with disabilities only date other disabled people, right? That's not necessarily true, especially people who have these invisible disabilities and get into great relationships with other people who aren't disabled. That you can't give consent because you don't understand boundaries. I think a lot of people with disabilities do, even if they can't verbalize it very well. I thought this one was really interesting. Sex doesn't have to be spontaneous. Some people, especially with physical disabilities, may have to plan days out for their sexual encounters, and that's fine. That's still groovy. That's something that is part of the conversation with your physician too, I think. Misconception we talked about a few times that you don't need privacy. It is my practice. Unless someone is completely nonverbal, I really try to have a conversation with everyone without a guardian in the room, at least for part of their visit. And that should be standard practice. I think some people don't think to do that, but we really should be. The last one is that you can't be parents. I'm not talking about just being pregnant. I'm talking about being a parent. So just because someone is living with a disability doesn't mean that they're not going to be able to be a parent. They may need more support. But yeah, I'd love if anyone wants to put in the chat any other misconceptions they might be able to come up with about sexual and reproductive health in disabled people. That would be great. Or maybe unmute. It doesn't look like it's a huge group.
Another question that comes up is, are issues, policy and coverage with sterilization similar to access and coverage of long-acting reproductive contraception?
I would say similar, but still different. Long-acting reversible contraception is reversible. They're similar in that it is controlling someone's fertility, and consent needs to be obtained and reviewed very carefully. The opposite is also true, though. What if you really don't want to have periods anymore and your caregiver doesn't believe in birth control for whatever reason, right? That's hard. That's a hard place to be. There's a lot of people out there who just don't want to have periods and want to be on hormones for reasons that are not just contraception, and expressing those desires can be difficult in the positive direction as well. The difference between a long-acting reversible contraceptive method and sterilization is, one, these contraceptive methods are less invasive. They're not surgeries. And two, they're reversible. I know there's a lot of information out there that vasectomies and tubal ligations are reversible. They're not designed to be reversible. And so that's, you're altering someone theoretically permanently, whereas the other contraceptive options can be reversed. So yes and no. And I'm not a lawyer, so keep that in mind.
We
No one
also
had-
had someone share with us the link to the international provider that does do the mail order abortion services, and they had a question about whether or not it was appropriate to share. And so I would put that, I guess, to you or anybody. I don't know who wants to be the person who decides that, but it's certainly, we can share it with anyone who wants it.
Yeah, let me just share from my perspective. Abortion is not illegal right now in our state or federally. So I would recommend that you go through a legal channel. I think that a lot of the news has been harmful in that a lot of people don't realize that they still have abortion access. In the state of Alaska, we've always been limited not by our laws, but by our geography. Right now, the only 3 abortion providers are in Fairbanks, Anchorage, and Juneau, which for someone with a physical disability is cumbersome. And unfortunately, like I said, for whatever reason, Planned Parenthood has interpreted our laws to mean that you have to go into the health center to take the pill. And that may change if abortion is no longer protected federally. Right now, we don't have any laws on the books in Alaska that would overturn a woman's right to choose. However, there has been legislation put before our legislature recently. So it's important to keep an eye on that. If you want to advocate one way or another on the state level, it will this summer be turned over to the states. In that case, that's when the online situation will change. So you can do whatever you want. There's a couple of these online programs. They can be harmful. They can be not harmful. I think that they will become more and more legitimate as time goes on. However, it's going to be harder and harder to tell the difference between something that's legitimate and not legitimate because technology is advancing very quickly. The other advantage to going to a reproductive health clinic versus doing an online thing is just talking to someone face to face about other issues like STI prevention and testing, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, that's my 2 cents. That was a lot. That was more than 2 cents. A lot of places also do telemedicine consults. So, and I'm not, most family medicine doctors and obstetricians have tons of training in reproductive health care. The only issue becomes your comfort level with someone you don't know.
We had some misconceptions submitted. Some misconceptions are that disabled folks can't get pregnant, and also the assumption that if they do get pregnant, that they will have a child with a disability or a health issue and have like awful discriminatory perceptions about that.
Great. That's a great contribution.
And Robin, I posted in the chat the phone number for the clinic so that if people have individual questions about birth control or any reproductive health options, they can either call and schedule a call with you or Sonia Martin Young, the nurse midwife at the clinic, or a telehealth visit. Because as you mentioned early on, each client, each patient, each person's experience and questions are different, and that may be a good fit for any of these questions.
Another question from the chat: as a doctor, do you see a connection between racism, sexism, and ableism when it comes to reproductive rights? For example, a woman of color who uses a power wheelchair is seeking different birth control options, but being denied by her current doctor.
Yes, it's the short answer to that. It's not just my experience, it's also borne out in the literature. This is a known fact, right? You see it across the board in marginalized populations, right? The more categories you fall into, the worse it is. And it's just awful in the space of people living with disabilities. If you look back at the history of forced sterilization, for example, like Black women with disabilities, they were specifically targeted, and in some instances still are, whether that's implicit or explicit. And that goes down to what birth control options are offered. I can't pull up a paper right now, but I know I've seen one in the past that providers are offering or emphasizing different contraceptive choices based on race and ethnicity. And that's troubling as well, right? It's the year 2022. I will say, there is a cultural component in my experience. When I did my medical school, I'm from Chicago. When I was working on the south side of Chicago and some of the clinics down there, there were some clinics that were in Hispanic neighborhoods where I saw only Spanish speaking clients all day, every day. And then there were some that were in historically Black communities where I was seeing African-American clients. And the cultural preferences that go into the birth control methods that people requested were also different. So I have to check my bias about what I think is a good birth control option and weigh it against what people culturally or historically are choosing. And it was pretty crazy how I would see like communities having one preference versus another. But at the same time, it's not that crazy. I think people who are looking for reproductive health care, the first people they go to is the people in their social circle. So does that answer the question?
I think so. If anyone had a follow-up, they could definitely ask.
Cool.
Oh, yes, very much.
I do want to give enough time for Carolyn to present about the rec room, and I would love to have more time for questions. So let's pause on the questions if everyone's okay, and let Carolyn talk about the rec room.
Thanks, Robin. Yeah, I also am really enjoying this conversation, so I'm hoping we can do more of this in the future. But I would love to talk about the rec room and the services that we provide there, primarily focusing on our sexual health education with the Rec Peer Education team. So here, first of all, you can meet the Rec Peer Education team and all of our wonderful faces. Tyler is our peer education coordinator, and they work with our teens who actually go with us into classrooms and into our virtual lessons, have the expertise of everything they need to know and everything a teen might need to know about sexual health and wellness. Sierra is our rec room coordinator, but she works actually down in our drop-in center, but she also does some sexual health education with us. Our teens are ages, I want to say 15 and up currently. We have a team of 5 people that kind of fluctuates and varies. but they are all paid employees of Kachemak Bay Family Planning Clinic. They come and meet regularly multiple times a week to learn the material that they're going to be teaching, to practice their presentation skills, and to answer questions from their peers. They also will, as I said before, go during school with us into other classrooms and help teach. Here is the rec room. So it is an open space for teens ages 12 to 18, right next to the Family Planning Clinic. It's completely free. Everything we ever do there is free. There are snacks, a ton of different activities, from art to outdoor kind of exploration gardening, to we do some music things. We've had some people come and teach beading. We had someone do radical poster making recently. So there's just a wide variety, and it's all based on what the teens themselves want to see and want to participate in. So our peer education team does virtual and in-person lessons for sexual health and wellness. We have a partnership with Kenai Peninsula Borough School District that allows us to go in with our curriculum and share it in any school essentially in the district that would like to have us. So they have approved our curriculum, and they've approved us as presenters to go in and participate and teach these lessons. We have taught lessons in this past year in Homer Middle School, Homer High School, Homer Flex School, at the Kenai Juvenile Correctional Facility, which is Marathon School, Susan B. English School in Seldovia, and Port Graham School and Nanwalek School. So some of those across the Bay schools we were able to travel to, and others we did virtually, which I think is something that kind of came out of COVID, when everyone was sort of forced to turn everything virtual, but now is actually proving to be something of a strength, because it's allowing us to reach folks we wouldn't otherwise be able to reach with some of these lessons. And so those virtual lessons are available to folks even outside of the area. If they wanted us to come in and teach, we have the ability to do that just via Zoom. So why do we use peer education? Our model involves teens teaching teens, and there are a few reasons. One is because, of course, simply that teens have more credibility with other teens than us old folks do. And so when a teen says something to another teen, they're just going to take it more seriously than if I were to tell them something. Also, it helps us maintain relevance. So our curriculum is highly flexible, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But it has a lot of input from our current peer education team. And so we're always getting feedback continually from both the folks that we teach and from our peer educators about what information is relevant to them and whether how we're sharing it is relevant. And so we just want to make sure that what we're sharing is on topic and of use to them in their lives. Peer education also helps to create a social support network. So teens can identify, fellow teens who know a lot about these issues, identify them as a safe peer to talk to, and also just get the conversation going in a way that's really productive and more informed than it might otherwise be. I'm seeing a question about whether the education classes are available online or via Zoom, and that teens in Anchorage really need this resource. Yes, we can provide them online via Zoom. We don't have them recorded just because the way that we teach them, it's very interactive, and it's also highly customized to whatever school population or whatever student population we're talking with. And so a lot of it is based on conversation and questions, and it's very interactive. So we certainly wouldn't want to provide anything that was like pre-recorded. I just don't think it would be as useful or effective. But definitely, I'm always happy to talk about providing an implementation via Zoom. I'll share my contact information at the end of this, and you all can shoot me an email and ask me any questions. I'd be happy to discuss that. So we believe that good sexual health education is comprehensive, evidence-informed, developmentally appropriate, trauma-informed, and inclusive. And I'll talk a little bit about what all those things mean. When we say it's comprehensive, we mean that it's a full picture of human sexuality that's not limited to areas of prevention. So previous models of sexual health education have really been focused on preventing pregnancy or preventing sexually transmitted infections or diseases. And while certainly those are, valid goals in some cases, we find that it's much more effective even at preventing those things, but also at creating people who are well informed about their own bodies and sexuality and can go forward and have a healthy sex life in the way that they choose to have it, to provide a really full picture of what sexuality is. So we use a model called the circles of sexuality. And there are 5 major areas that all surround this bottom area. So I'll go through them. Sensuality is kind of the physical aspect of sexuality, like the touch related aspect. Intimacy refers more to the kind of emotional closeness that is present. Sexual orientation and gender identity, otherwise known as who someone might be attracted to and how they see themselves gender-wise. Reproduction and sexual health, kind of what we already talked about with Robin, kind of more the anatomical and the physical biological processes. And then sexual behaviors and practices, which includes anything from, things that people engage in, from like flirting to what kind of sex ultimately they are into, and also can include the harmful aspects of sexual behavior, including sexual assault and abuse. And then these all are surrounding the major circle that we see as like anchoring all of this, which is power and agency. A person's power and agency over their own body, which I know kind of gets into the piece that we were discussing before, where, what happens when someone is in a situation where they don't necessarily have legal control over their own body and their own agency. So it's definitely, I think, a really rich topic for conversation that really needs to be explored. I see another question. Is there a possibility of a place similar to this in the Anchorage area, or a similar place like the rec room that I'm aware of in the area? I don't know of a place in Anchorage that is like the rec room, but I can do a little bit of research and get back to you about that. And I do know that there is someone who provides sexual health education in the Anchorage area that is financed through the same state grant that we are. Her name is Jordan Kamer, and I'm not super familiar with what her sort of schedule of presentation is, or where she goes, or how often. But I know that she is kind of connected to this same funding source, so we do have some things in common. Yes, Jordan at Anchorage Public Health. Yep, Kamer, Kamer, is her last name. So I could definitely look into what kind of places there might be like the rec room, and get back to you about that. Okay, let me go to the next slide. Okay, so when we talk about evidence-informed, developmentally appropriate, and trauma-informed sexual health education, what we're really saying is it's sexual health education that is focused on the needs of the students. So we're conveying facts. Certainly, it's based in research, and we want it to always be factual, and but we're not limited to what is demonstrated by research. We also are able to take into account the age, the experience, the understanding, the well-being of our students. So I forgot to add sort of the culture of our students. That would go in there as well. I mean, basically any nuance of student experience that we can have access to ahead of time to help us shape how we're teaching things, we're able to incorporate that into our lessons. And then just by virtue of the fact that we have really open conversations, we take that into account as well. So, but our curriculum is very flexible. We have sort of a core of subjects that I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. Oh my gosh, I got to talk fast. It's 12:53. But those can be presented in, say we teach a range from like 7th or I guess 6th grade all the way up through high school seniors. And so obviously there's going to be, folks are at different developmental levels, and we would, perhaps focus more on the puberty aspect while we're in our middle school settings versus, in our older high school settings, we might focus more on birth control options. So let's see, I see someone commenting that Alaska Behavioral Health runs the Power Youth Drop-In Center in Anchorage. That's cool. I haven't heard of that before. I'll have to check that out. And the question arises, do we teach any classes in school settings? Yes, very much. So we do go in. So for example, at Homer High School, we teach the freshman health class. We have our implementation takes up a whole quarter every year, and we go in and we teach all the freshmen, and it's so it's 6 weeks that we get with them, and it's a really big a big implementation, and it's a lot of fun. And we've done, in fact, all of these that I've listed previously, all the schools that I mentioned before, that's all taking place during school, like in a class setting. Okay, so, and then inclusive sexual health education. Basically, we want to make sure that all students see themselves reflected in the curriculum. So we're including diverse representations of race, gender, sexuality, disability, mental health, body type, beliefs, income level, lived experience. And that extends beyond representation to meaningful discussion. And so this is sort of part of being, in my opinion, part of being trauma informed. So it's kind of interesting. We didn't used to be able to go into schools and teach this. This was a little bit less accepted, but since the Alaska Safe Children's Act was passed, which incorporates Bree's Law and Aaron's Law, which are designed to help prevent teen dating violence and sexual abuse of children, that in a way opened the door for us a little bit, so that we can, everyone is legally required to receive this information in a school setting, information about sexual abuse and information about teen dating violence. So these are topics that someone has got to talk to these young people about, and they're topics that many teachers don't feel prepared to talk to young people about, because those are huge topics, and they're also can be really sensitive topics, and to talk about them in a way that doesn't feel harmful, or that feels healthy and productive and safe. It's a real challenge for some teachers to just kind of, stick that on top of whatever their history classes or whatever they're already prepared to teach. So that's something that we do discuss, and we really focus on making sure it's happening in a safe and supportive way. So let's see. These are just kind of some of the things that we cover. I don't want to spend too long on it because we're just running out of time, and I could talk about this forever. But as you can see, it's a wide variety. We talk about sexting, we talk about STIs, sexual orientation. We practice a lot of communication skills, and we talk about healthy relationships. And then the really important parts, in my opinion, are how we do it. So that involves creating group agreements to create a safe and supportive environment for learning. We have students get a chance to practice and identify their own values and beliefs, and we keep the conversations relevant to their lives so they can ask questions anonymously. It's a safe thing for them to do. We spend a lot of time answering anonymous questions. It also gives them a chance to build relationships with safe adults, both us, and we have a homework assignment in which they take home a conversation sheet to bring to someone they identify as a safe adult in their lives, and start to discuss these issues, so that later on in that student's life, if they have a question, they've already established that they have a safe person in their life that they can begin to have this conversation with. And we also just have a ton of fun while we're doing it. the main idea is that students get the information they need to make the choices that are right for them. So there's no like one size fits all sexual health education program, because sexuality is individual to each and every one of us. And this is where I think it's completely common to people who live with disabilities and people who don't experience disabilities, that all of it is tied into who a person is as a whole. And it's not separate, as Robin was saying, those kind of intersecting identities create a lot of, unfortunately, sort of a nexus of discrimination for people in the healthcare setting. What they also do is, for an individual, help determine who they are and what kind of sexuality is right for them in their life. And so what we're trying to do is to help students begin to understand what that might look like for them going forward and make the healthiest, most positive choices for them. So there's my email address, carolyn@kbfpc.org. You can find the rec room at homerrecroom.org. I'm super excited. We're launching a new website on Friday. It'll be at that same address. And also we're on Instagram at Homer Rec Room. So feel free to follow us. And then Claudia has posted a bunch of contact information and more information about us in the chat. And thank you so much for having us. It was so wonderful. I have a question. Is it okay if I answer this question or address it really quick? I know I've gone over a little bit, maybe. It says, the timing of seeking reproductive health services. Can you discuss if the timeframes for when disabled folks access care is any different than non-disabled people, like wellness exams, screenings, etc.? The general recommendations seem to change, and I wonder if you can discuss what that looks like for people with disabilities or chronic health conditions. Is it any different? Robin, that seems like that might be a you question.
That does sound like a me question. I agree. So I think there's two components to that. One is general health screenings. I don't think that I can't think of a specific example of why someone with disabilities would need, for example, a mammogram any earlier than someone without a disability, unless that person is experiencing a genetic disability that predisposes them to certain conditions. But the act of having a disability or experiencing any sort of disability really doesn't change when you need your first pelvic exam, or when you need your first mammogram, or when you need your lab work done. I think people who experience disabilities end up contacting the healthcare system much more frequently because they need support in other ways. But as far as general screenings, I'm struggling to come up with something other than some specific genetic traits that may do that. I would say, though, to the when should you start seeing someone about sexual and reproductive health care is before it becomes an issue, is the answer there. Same with end life care, before it's an issue, so that, and this goes back to the intersection, like with what we do at the rec room and what we do as a medical facility, is empowering people to be educated about this topic before they're faced with an issue where it's an emergency, right? So a lot of youth who have disabilities experience the healthcare system earlier than youth who don't have disabilities, and making sure that you as a caregiver or you as a person are bringing that up with your provider early and often to make sure that you're prepared for when you might want to be on something for contraception, or how you might come up with communication tools when sexy times come around, right? So yes, I would recommend that a person living with disabilities talks about sexual and reproductive health earlier, because the transition from being a pediatric patient to an adult patient looks a little bit different for them.
I would just also add that because of the fact that people who live with disabilities are statistically more likely to be victims of violence, sexual violence, that I think it's doubly important. I mean, I personally believe that young people should have access to sexual health education and information as early as they're able to talk about it in a way that's developmentally appropriate for them. But I just think it's extra important for people who experience disabilities because of that increased risk.
100%.
Well, thank you so very much. This has actually been a really, really good, and Erica just put as well, educational opportunity for us to kind of get some more information. And who knows, maybe hopefully a little further into the year, we can kind of have a part 2. It seemed we had some really good questions flowing, so it would be really great to continue that and get some more dialogue going. I think that would be pretty awesome. So I'm definitely going to touch base with you, Claudia, to see about maybe doing a part 2 a little bit further. Like, again, I think this is a great conversation. So thank you again so much. And if anybody has any questions further, don't hesitate to reach out. We do have all of their contact information right here in the chat. So please don't hesitate to reach out and ask any additional questions you might have. And we will, 2 people will be receiving an email from me for our door prize. So look forward to that. And then we hope you'll join us next month for our next Tea Talk as well. So again, thank you, Robin, Claudia, and Carolyn. It was amazing talking to you. And thank you so much for all of the information.
Thanks for hosting us. And anyone, if you're interested beyond the recording in the actual slides, I've shared them with Crystal in a PDF form. So thank you for hosting us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all so much for the wonderful conversation.
Yes, thanks. I've appreciated all the questions.
Well, everybody have a fantastic rest of your day.
You too. Thanks.
Bye.